All right, so um, we discover in book one, well, and two, that justice is not so easily defined. We looked at Cephalus, we looked at Polemarchus, we looked at Thrasymachus. And it was actually Thrasymachus' definition of justice that seemed to create the most trouble. One of the confusing things is toward the middle of book two, Glaucon takes over for Thrasymachus. But Thrasymachus' definition of justice was the advantage of the stronger. And then he tells the Ring of Gyges story. Actually, Glaucon does, in support of Thrasymachus. And the Ring of Gyges story seems to suggest that if people are given the ability to not have to deal with the consequences of their actions, and that's what is meant by invisibility, then they would do anything unjust in order to get appetitive things, because the guy in the Ring of Gyges, the shepherd, uses the power of invisibility basically to screw over all of his friends and everybody else and worm his way into being king. Point there is, by nature, people are unjust. Or at least that's what Gyges, the Ring of Gyges story, is trying to support. So then that means that if we're going to argue for justice itself, think back to form of justice and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be a difficult argument. And right around on page 151, right around line 368e, Socrates begins a way of discussing justice, where he says, I'm going to compare the justice of the city with the justice of the soul. And he says, there's a single, we say, don't we, that there is the justice of a single man and also the justice of a whole city, certainly. And a city is larger than a single man. It is. Perhaps then there's more justice in the larger thing, and it'll be easier for us to learn what it is. So there's justice in the man, in the soul of the man, and there's justice in the city. And there is a relationship, he is going to argue, between these two. But remember the tripartite soul, which would then mean that there is a rational part of the city, there is an emotional or spirited part of the city, and there is an appetitive part of the city. And what he argues then, beginning at 369e, is the sort of evolution or transition of a city from the minimum city to the luxurious city. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the arguments, but read carefully again page 151 through 155. And essentially what he talks about is that cities start out with a bare minimum of 4 to 5 people, he says. And this is absolute simple self-sufficiency. And a couple of key features is that men must live in cities, he says, because we cannot survive on our own. But the problem with the minimum city is that it provides the absolute basic necessities, but the minimum city here is really not enough. And so what tends to happen is that in human political systems, you get what's called a division of labor. And if you've ever taken any economics, you know what is meant by division of labor. Division of labor is a process by which people specialize in certain fields, and when they specialize in certain fields, you get a far more efficient means of production. So what that means is, when you get more efficient production, you get greater wealth. And so what's going on in the what's going on in this analogy is that this line as division of labor increases, so does the wealth of the city. And so over time, what happens is you start out here, at the small minimum city, but eventually, as you get a greater division of labor and more efficient production, wealth increases. Until you get to a certain point, and it's not an exact point, but let's just establish it here, when he begins to talk about the beginnings of commercialism. As he suggests, around, let me give you the line reference, around line, 371. In around line 371, he talks about the need for import-export, and then you're going to need merchants, and once you need merchants, you're going to need ports and warehouse districts and all that. In other words, your city moves more toward commercialism. So this self-sufficiency, the old city, was one of agrarian society. These were largely people who produced food and what they needed. But then every agrarian society eventually becomes more commercial, and when it is commercial, it becomes luxurious. And so what he talks about is no longer what he called here the healthy city, but what begins to happen over time is people are less interested in what they need. So they're less interested in sufficiency and more interested in luxury. And so that's when he says a city comes to have a fever. And so around line 373, he says, all right, I understand it isn't merely the origin of a city that we're considering, it seems, but the origin of a luxurious city. Now, what begins to happen in the luxurious city is, things become far more, necessities. Luxuries become necessities. And so all of a sudden, people need more and more stuff. As an example, you might think, depending, not to date myself or, call anybody out, but if you've been around the block a little bit, you might remember the times before Starbucks. Or you might remember when cell phones were, before they existed. And then when they did exist, there were those huge honking ones that very few people had. You could think of all these things. Bottled water, for instance, right? There used to never be bottled water. It was perfectly sufficient for people to drink out of a fountain, right? And there were fountains everywhere at one point. But anyway, there's a difference between, what is self-sufficient and what is luxurious. And so what happens is, he says, when people get a little taste of wealth, they want more and more. And so when the city becomes more about luxury, then the city has to expand. And so he suggests at around line, where is it? Like page 153, toward the bottom of 153. This is 373b. We must enlarge our city, for the healthy one is no longer adequate. He continues saying you're going to need people like, actors and wet nurses and hunters and all these people, artists and writers that you never needed before. So in other words, I'm going to put frivolity. You need a lot more frivolous people. Because if you think about it, right, even if we devote ourselves to, like, say, cupcakes, for instance, like Sprinkles cupcakes down in Dallas, there never used to be just a cupcake shop. It would have been unheard of 20 years ago. But when you have a more luxurious economy that is really hyper-diversified and very consumer-oriented, then you can get frivolities like bottled water. And I'm not saying that bottled water is necessarily frivolity, but compared to your grandparents, perhaps it is. They likely would never have considered buying a bottle of water for, $2. So you get more frivolous stuff. And specifically, when our city is more interested in frivolity, that means we're going to have to increase our borders. So we have to expand borders. And when we have to expand borders, we're going to have to take land. And so when we begin to expand not just our economy to frivolous things, but we have to literally expand our borders to get more land, because as he suggests, we're going to need more cattle and more farming resources, then you are going to need an army. It's also significant that, and we're right in the height of this, right, in our own culture, on page 154, around line D, so this would be 373D, he says one of the things about the luxurious city is that it needs a lot more doctors. Because in the self-sufficient city, you don't really need doctors because people have a moderate diet. And the diet is simple. And because of the simple and moderate diet, you don't really need doctors. But in the city of luxury, there's a lot of pastries and there's a lot of red meat. And these things, so lots of sugar and lots of meat, which ultimately means that you'll need lots of doctors, which you never needed in the self-sufficient city. Ironic, yeah? But then what comes when we need an army to expand our markets or to expand our the resources that we need in terms of land, you get this interesting need for a new class of citizen called the guardian. And the guardian is sort of like the army class. These are guys who are charged with protecting the city. Now the thing about the guardians is that the guardians have to possess a very unique nature, because the guardians have to be both gentle to the citizens that they're protecting as well as fierce to the peoples that they are going to engage with and destroy, because the guardians make up the army. So how do you find someone who is both gentle and fierce? He gives us an interesting analogy, and he says right towards the end of book 2, he talks about the pedigree dog. Now, the pedigree dog, and he's not making fun of these guys. He's not trying to compare them to dogs. But the pedigree dog is a dog who protects his household, and he takes care of the family he lives with, but he protects the family from those he doesn't, and he does so based on knowledge. And so right at the end of this book, what Socrates says is, because it judges anything. He's talking about the pedigree dog. So I'm on line 376B, page 155. Because it judges anything it sees to be either a friend or an enemy on no other basis than that it knows the one and doesn't know the other. And how could it be anything besides a lover of learning if it defines what is its own and what is alien to it in terms of knowledge and ignorance? It couldn't. But surely the love of learning is the same thing as philosophy and the love of wisdom. Indeed, he says. So the deal is, guardians, then, are a rare breed who have to be basically a contradiction. They have to be a contradiction of violence and gentleness. And the way to make this happen is philosophy. So philosophy, because it teaches the difference between, it teaches the forms, it teaches the things in themselves. What philosophy does is it lets us know the difference between good and bad. And so by the time you get this city, you need the G for guardian class to know the difference between good and bad. In other words, they need to know what justice is itself, not justice as they understand it. Because the guardians are not in charge, and they're not the economy. I'll explain this in a minute. They are in the middle and must do what is just for the whole. Okay, check out the very next episode here, and we'll have it all come together.